This is the Sony RX1R III, and it's a camera that is causing a bit of a stir online recently, and not in an entirely good way. You see, this is a camera that fans have been waiting for around 10 years now, and when it finally arrived, well, instead of being met with applause, let's just say that the phrase, "what the fuck," was trending for about 24 hours in most camera forums. Why? Well, most of you will already know that this thing is very expensive. I'm talking $5,100 worth of expensive. And with that kind of price tag, Sony is very quickly moving into Leica territory, and if you're gonna do that, you better be offering something that can throw a punch or two. Unfortunately though, I don't think this camera has pulled that off, for reasons we'll obviously get into in this video, and I'm not alone in having that opinion, with many people online suggesting that this could be Sony's biggest flop of all time. Oh, brother, this guy stinks! So, how did we get here? How did Sony go from innovator to alienator? And more importantly, is the RX1R3 actually a bad camera, or is this just a case of right idea but wrong execution? Well, before we get into all of that drama, you probably noticed that this is not my usual studio, and that's because I'm currently just outside of Seattle at this year's Sony Kando event, which, if you didn't know, is basically a holiday camp for creators surrounded by a mountain of Sony camera gear to try out, and, well, literal mountains. But even with all of this Sony kit available to try out, the one camera I made a direct beeline for was this RX1, because I wanted to see for myself what all the fuss was about. So, let's start with the good stuff, because there is actually quite a lot to like about this camera, and this is coming from somebody who's never used an RX1 in their life. First up, there's the sensor, because this thing is now sporting the same 61 megapixel full frame chip as the Sony A7CR and the A7R5. So with this much resolution to play around with, you're now able to crop internally to replicate longer focal lengths with the press of a button. You can zoom in to 50mm or a 70mm equivalent, but obviously all of that comes at the loss of some megapixels. And this, I found, was actually really useful, given the fact that this has a fixed 35mm prime lens on the front, so this crop mode actually makes this camera a lot more flexible. It should also be noted that when shooting in RAW and using this crop mode, the crops aren't actually permanent, and by that I mean that all the camera is doing here is kind of pre-cropping the RAW file for you, so that when you open it up in post, you can actually revert back to the original full uncropped image. Now obviously shooting with a 61 megapixel full frame sensor does mean that you capture an absurd level of detail and resolution, but just in a much more compact form, because this camera is also very tiny. Well, kinda, because it still has a fairly chunky lens on the front, but we'll talk more about that in a moment. For now though, I should mention that all of the photos that you are currently looking at here are RAW files shot with this camera and edited using my own set of presets, which you can buy on my website. Be sure to check out the link in the pinned comment below for a link and also a bonus discount. But if editing RAWs really isn't your thing, then the good news is that Sony also has decided to add its own list of film-like shooting modes onto this camera, which is clearly the company's attempt at replicating Fujifilm film simulations. And to their credit, most of them are actually pretty tasteful, so if shooting JPEG straight out the camera is more your thing, then they've got you covered. Speaking of images, as I've already mentioned, I'm currently away from home, shooting, editing, and trying to juggle multiple files across multiple devices, whilst also living out of a backpack, so far from perfect. But luckily, just before I left, I set up this, the brand new Ugreen NAS Sync DXP 4800 Plus, a high-performance NAS that basically has become my entire remote studio. Now, if you've never used a NAS before, think of it as your own personal cloud, but faster, cheaper, and without any kind of subscription fees or privacy concerns. Currently, I have four 4TB hard drives taking up all 4 slots of the NAS, but theoretically you can store up to 136 terabytes of local storage, which is pretty mind-blowing. And Ugreen NAS offers wide compatibility for third-party hard drives and SSDs. This thing offers full support for RAW files from all major cameras, and thanks to the AI Album Assistant, it can intelligently sort my shots into people, places, and moments, which means no more digging through endless folders. And when I'm done for the day, I can sync everything back from Google Drive, or just beam it straight to my team so that they can start editing instantly, even while I'm still in the field. This thing moves fast too. We're talking 1,250 megabytes a second fast. So if you're ready to ditch cloud subscriptions and streamline your entire workflow like I have, check out the link in the description and pinned comment below, and be sure to use the code on screen now for 20% off your own Ugreen NAS. And thank you to Ugreen for sponsoring this episode. Ow. Anyway, back to this camera, because inside it also packs in the latest Bions XR processor and dedicated AI processing unit, which basically means you're getting Sony's latest and greatest autofocus system. That means subject detection, real-time tracking, and all of that good stuff. And as you would kind of expect from a Sony AF system, it really does not miss a beat. The old pop-up style EVF has now been replaced with a proper fixed viewfinder on the top here, and whilst some of you may be rejoicing about that decision, unfortunately the EVF they've gone with is noticeably low resolution by modern standards, which is slightly disappointing. But that minor gripe aside, so far so good, right? Sounds like a pretty solid camera. Well, yeah, but there are also a lot of compromises with this thing, some of which might seem pretty shocking for a camera with such a lofty price tag. For starters, a proper IBIS system is still missing from this camera, and in 2025, that's kinda wild. It's not weather sealed either, and they've also done away with the built-in flash, which I'm assuming has been done because they needed to make more space for the fixed EVF. The screen on the back is now fixed in place, which I personally think is a big mistake, because cameras like this are absolutely screaming to be used by street and travel photographers. Taking away a flip screen not only makes it almost impossible to shoot discreetly from the hip, but it also makes this camera just a bit more difficult to use when composing from low or high angles. Also, whilst it's great that this thing is so small and lightweight, that too does come with a list of compromises. Firstly, as someone with larger hands, I do find this thing kind of awkward and uncomfortable to hold. This thumb rest on the back here is doing its best to keep this thing locked in my hands, but I am constantly terrified that I'm going to drop it somewhere and then I'll need to flee the country and change my name to avoid Sony charging me for this astronomically expensive camera. I think they've bugged the room. Now, you can buy an optional thumb grip attachment that you can slip straight into the hot shoe port here, and I would imagine that would improve things quite a bit. But given the fact that it costs a bull-convulsing $300, I think we'll file that one firmly under no. Luckily though, I did remember to pack my trusty PGY Tech wrist strap, which is way more affordable, and I'll be sure to leave a link in the pinned comment below as to where you can buy this at the best price available if you're interested. Anyway, the smaller frame also means that it has to rely on the smaller FW50 batteries, which just don't hold as much juice as the larger FZ100s. Now, in fairness, Sony has stated that the battery life has been improved by around 3 times compared to the older Mark II model, but personally, I wouldn't feel comfortable walking around with this thing all day without a few spares shoved in my pocket. Close the door on your way out, please. While Sony has updated the sensor, the processor, the autofocus, and the viewfinder, they didn't touch the lens. This is still the very same 35mm f2 Zeiss optic found on the original RX1, a lens first introduced over a decade ago, back in 2012. Now, to be fair, Sony have stated that the lens has been micron adjusted to better align with the new 61MP sensor's demands for tighter tolerances and subtle calibrations. All very fancy. Now, that's not me saying that this is a terrible lens, because it really isn't, but it is an old one. And when you're charging over $5,000, slapping a decade-old optic on the front does feel like a bit of a shortcut to me. And that kind of leads us nicely onto the biggest issue haunting this camera: the price. Now, no matter how you want to slice it, $5,100 is an insane amount of money to pay for a camera like this, especially when you consider that the Sony A7C-R, which offers the same internal specs as this thing, is priced at just under $3,000 brand new, or potentially even cheaper if you can get hold of a decent second-hand unit. And that camera actually includes IBIS and has a larger battery, better ergonomics, and of course the benefit of interchangeable lenses. Now, granted, that price I've just quoted is for the body only, but with a little over $2,000 left in your pocket, you could easily get yourself a 35mm f1.4 G Master, which is not only much faster but also just a better performer optically. But if that's too big for you, then there's always the Zeiss 35mm f2.8, which is slightly slower but way more compact and affordable. Look, the point I'm trying to make here is that with the A7CR, you at least have options. With this, you don't. And in most real-world shooting scenarios, the A7CR either matches or beats this RX1R III in performance at least. So the question remains, what exactly are we paying for here, and what were Sony thinking when they came up with this price? Well, I guess one answer would be form factor, because we all know that there's a premium to pay for something this small and this powerful. But I do think that the more honest answer is just for the prestige, and this is where I think Sony may have probably gotten a little bit overconfident. Now personally, I think this was Sony's attempt at Leica-ing themselves, making something exclusive, expensive, and built to satisfy a very specific kind of buyer, perhaps one with more money than sense. And don't get me wrong, this camera almost fits the bill. It's solid, it's good looking, it's understated in all of the right ways, but Sony isn't Leica. And it never will be. That's because Leica leans into the romance of photography. Those cameras give you tactile controls, film-inspired design, high-quality German engineering, and a red dot with a century of legacy. Now, whatever you personally think about Leica cameras, one thing is for certain, the company has well and truly earned that level of prestige. Sony just hasn't, but that's okay, because that's not why most people buy Sony cameras. Sony gives you precision, high performance and reliability. They might not be as sexy as Leica, but they certainly are clinical workhorses that get the job done for working professionals. So when they deliver a $5,000 camera like this that doesn't offer any kind of rationality or innovation that we would expect, it just stops making sense, no matter how good it might look dangling around your neck. So does this mean that this is Sony's biggest flop? Well, no, not technically. It's still a beautifully made camera that delivers stunning results in a compact body. But as a product launch and as a message to the people who waited a decade for this, well, yeah, it might be to some. And from what I've heard here at Kando from other shooters way more talented than me, the sentiment seems to be the same. This is not a bad camera, it's just very hard to justify.